2, 1. Hey, we're live.
Hey, calling Chris Anderson back in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, in fact, and calling Rick Beyer in
Back in Chicago.
Chicago. Wow, so all things are well, and we're
It is great, right? The world has untilted from its axis. It's the way it should be again, and here we are. And welcome to everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Chris, you and I, we're here every Sunday drinking and
talking
about history and sometimes drinking also. And I want to give a big thank you to the growing list of folks supporting this effort via Patreon, especially our top shelf sponsors. Chris, can I read their names this time?
It's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Ferber, Stephen Dean, Eric Flint, Doug McCord, Ted Moon, Pamela Ryman, Chris Templin, Neil Hilliard, Ward Cornett, and Phil Messina. And if you want to help keep the history taps open, that link is just scrolling right across the screen. I hope it's not too fast for you. And Chris, who have we got? We got who's here? Who's here watching?
Well, God, we've got Lynn Hargrove, Jean Templin, Valerie from Normandy, Lizzie Borden.
We have Gail from Texas, who was just on the Revolutionary War tour.
So she made it back. Good.
Yeah,
good.
And
Ken, Tom.
Excellent.
All sorts of folks.
All sorts of amazing folks.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? Have we killed enough time to be able to be ready to start this puppy?
I believe we have.
All right, well, give me a drum roll.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and what's on tap today, Chris?
Yeah, well, we've got a very interesting topic. We're leaving kind of our familiar ground here, and also a very controversial topic. We're going to be joined tonight by Bryan Burrough, who is the co-author, along with Chris Tomlinson and Jason Stanford, of Forget the Alamo, a new historiographical look at the Alamo and the uses and misuses of history. And this is a book that author Robert Draper has called an all-too-timely tale of how fable, told forcefully and frequently enough, makes its insidious way into history books. Burroughs is the author of 6 books, including Days of Rage, The Big Rich, Public Enemies, and co-author of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Barbarians at the Gate. And I should also point out that he lives in Texas, so that kind of gives him some legitimacy in what we're going to be talking about.
And now, Bryan, you're also a veteran of History Happy Hour.
There you go. And what
your
other
career
accolade.
pinnacle has happened.
Cheers! Cheers!
Excellent. I don't know if you have a cocktail, but I'm drinking beer today, Chris. And
yeah. Well, I couldn't find a Lone Star here in London, but I got a Soul, so I guess that's
close
enough. As close as I can get. Yeah.
Close enough. Well, Bryan, welcome so much to the show, and Chris, I'm going to let you start off the questioning.
Yeah,
the interrogation. Author interrogation.
Well, I want to start with just a passage from the book, and this is from the book, and it says, the Alamo, its legend comprises the beating heart of Texas exceptionalism, the idea deeply held among generations of Texans that the state is special, somehow a cut above the Delawares and Rhode Islands of the world. Its story, as Steinbeck suggests, is thus prized as a kind of civic religion. It's not an overstatement to say that the Alamo is the state's secular western wall, its secular Mecca. Somewhat as Jews and Muslims have struggled over the Temple Mount, so Anglos, African American, Mexican American, Tejanos, and Native Americans are now debating the future of the Alamo and its meaning. So, given the heavy weight of its meaning and its history, what were you thinking by diving into this project?
I think my co-authors would tell you guys that I didn't know. And I grew up in Texas, but I was gone for 30 years. And this is the first book that I've written while back in Texas about Texas. And, this set out to be kind of a lark, a secondary book, a little art film book that we would do at nights and the weekends. And it became a much bigger book in terms of the story we ended up telling. But then when it dropped in Texas, it dropped with an impact. And I guess I was naive not to understand how holy this legend is. Not only the legend of the Alamo, but the whole legend of the Texas Revolution. And to challenge the history of that, the facts of that, to try to reclaim what actually happened as opposed to the beloved legend, sure has irked a lot of people.
Yeah.
Bryan, your book is called. I'm not going to go with the long excerpt like Chris. I'm going to go much shorter. Your book is called "Forget the Alamo." Clearly, you don't want us to forget the Alamo because you just wrote a book about it. But what should we remember and what should we forget?
Well, Forget the Alamo was, I mean, if you're going to write a provocative title on Texas history, that is the title, right? I mean, you kind of have to go with it. But yes, we're not trying to get people to forget the facts of it, but to forget the myths associated with it. And there are generally two sets of myths that the book and I and Chris and Jason have addressed, and that is the myths about the battle itself, the lead up, what actually happened, because so little is understood about what actually happened, but also the bigger questions of the Texas Revolution, why it was being fought, what it was even about, that type of stuff. The legend of it all that's been accepted and taught here for going on 200 years is, frankly, much of it is not supported by the facts of history. And once we realized that academics over the last 30, 40 years have really constructed a new picture of the Texas Revolution and the battle itself, that's when we thought, wow, there's grounds here for a popular history defined as when aging middle-aged white journalists like me dive into the academic scholarship and attempt to present it in an accessible way to them.
Okay, so but Bryan, for those of us who aren't from Texas, I mean, we have a general idea maybe about the revolution and what happens at the Alamo, but just for our viewers, what's the baseline? What's the myth that is kind of the accepted?
Wait, you don't know all this by heart?
Well, I
You don't recite it over the table on St. Jacinto Day?
no, my father-in-law used to, but I used to shut that out. But no, so what's
the accepted myth is that what's known is that in 1821, the newly independent nation of Mexico, eyeing its lonely, sparsely settled northern province of Texas, which was threatened by persistent Comanche raids, needed some people there as kind of a buffer. And a bunch of Americans decided they'd like to come in and settle and farm cotton. They were invited in, and 15 years later, they revolted. The legend has always been that they revolted for their freedom because Mexico was oppressing them. And frankly, that just doesn't bear out. They were as free, in fact, freer. They had more, they were given more laws than just about anybody in Mexico. And there's really nothing to support the idea that they were oppressed. Once they revolted, the president of Mexico, Santa Anna, marches in to put down the revolt. The first battle of significance is at the Alamo in March of 1836. And there, as everybody knows, a small group of 180 some odd Texans was overwhelmed by something like 6,000 Mexicans, killed to a man, but their time of their fight delayed Santa Anna long enough for the legendary Sam Houston to raise an army, which then defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of St. Jacinto 6 weeks later. Unfortunately, not only is that really not supported by facts, the timing, the delay bit, but a lot of the whole what happened, the idea that they fought to the last man, that they, the fact is we now know from Mexican accounts they offered to surrender, and Santa Anna wouldn't take it. They didn't fight for the,
don't say that.
Last man. As many as half of them ran out in the open and were run down by Mexican cavalry. And I mean, it wasn't quite the heroic legend in every regard that we've come to believe. It's what I grew up with. In Texas, we all take Texas history in 7th grade. It's more than history here. This is Texas identity. It is the heart of the idea of Texas exceptionalism, which, as silly as it may sound, if you're in Chicago or Rhode Island, it's a very real thing here, and it's a thing that people care deeply about. And if we didn't know that before, we now know it from the reaction to this book.
I'm just going to say I am from Rhode Island, and it's which you've now mentioned twice already, and it's a fine state, and we'll have words about that later.
And someday it'll grow up and be Massachusetts.
Right, someday maybe watch your smart remarks, Chris. So I imagine let's look at some of the pieces of this, Bryan. I imagine that one thing that has caused hit a nerve with people is the assertion that the underlying cause of this rebellion is actually slavery. That the people, the Anglos who were settling in Texas, were fighting in essence to preserve slavery. And I'm sure that having written about that, you get people saying, "Oh, Bryan, that's just a lot of woke crap that you're spinning because of the way things are these days." But in fact, it's right there in all the documents, right? It's right there in all the letters of Stephen Austin and everybody else.
If you go back and you read the correspondence of the father of Texas, Stephen F. Austin, who was the head of the colony, the founding father of the colony, he spent more time probably in Mexico City and elsewhere fighting for the rights for the Texans to keep slaves than just about any other issue. The fact was, for the Texans, for the American colonists in Mexico, this slavery was primarily an economic issue, not a moral issue. They came to farm cotton, and in their minds, they had to have slaves, or they would be penniless. The new Mexican government, as backward as generations of Americans have wanted to portray it, was fiercely abolitionist, was against slavery, and did their best to outlaw in Texas again and again. And every time Austin would say, "That's it. If you outlaw slavery, we're done. Everybody's going home," which was true. And every time the Mexicans said, okay, we'll give you another year, another 18 months, but then no more slaves. And eventually this went on for 15 years. And we argue in the book, and a lot of academics now argue, that was the underlying cause. That was the thing that drove the two sides apart. Yes, the trigger had to do with taxes, but no one's actually gone in and argued that this was a tax revolt. The fact was there was only one thing that the two sides ever fought about with regularity, and that was slavery. And in the documentation that swirls through the revolt, in the Constitution, it's never, of course, called slavery that they were fighting for, because that wasn't cool even in 1836. It was always referred to as property, their property rights. Because the Texans had more, given most of their land was free, they had far more capital invested in slavery than in any other asset of the economy. So it was a huge deal for the Texans.
So, and Bryan, one of the things that I've always been curious about is clearly, there's immigration into Texas. They're invited by the Mexican government, Americans, to settle in Texas. But there are people already there. What if any part do, I don't want to say if native is the right word, but Mexican American Tejanos, how do they view this?
Well, what you have to remember is there weren't many of them. After a previous revolt in the 1812 time frame, most of the people in Texas were either dead or had fled. There were, circa 1820, a grand total of 3 towns in Texas holding maybe 4,000 people. And need I point out, before the pandemic, there are office buildings in New York that have more people in them than were in the entire state of Texas in 1821, when the Texans first started coming in. Now, the Tejanos that were there, mostly centered, the moneyed ones were in San Antonio, were entirely supportive of the American presence. It was good for commerce. And they became, old families like the Seguins became kind of the diehard allies of the American colonists, both before fighting broke out and when the fighting broke out. A lot of Tejanos rode with the Texans and fought at San Jacinto.
And is their story part of the narrative?
It is. It's a big part of the narrative, and it's a big part of something that we wanted to put back, because the legend of Texas birth is so Anglo-centric and so dominated by what white folks did. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but the fact is what got left out was the contribution of the Tejanos. And they were written out of history, much like they were pushed out of the state after the revolution, in a kind of really ugly ethnic cleansing, in which a lot of their livestock and their farm, their land was taken. And as that happened, as the Tejanos emerged into a new Anglo-centric society of kind of grinding racism and poverty, they were henceforth written out of Texas history. I mean, if you go back and you read just about all the histories in the 1800s and into the 1900s, you'd hardly ever know there were people. A lot of these books refer to Texas as a wilderness. The idea that there were people there who were deeply involved in this cause, in this revolution, was largely lost to history until the first generation of Mexican-American historians began emerging from PhD programs in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of what we know now, the totality of it began then, and has evolved over the last 50 years. We stand on the shoulders, and the book Forget the Alamo stands on the shoulders of an awful lot of academics who have done this work from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and especially just in the last 20 years, beginning to look at the importance of slavery to all this. That was kind of the third rail that nobody really wanted to go against for so long because it was so controversial.
Bryan, I want to remind everybody that we are talking here today with Bryan Burrough, who's one of the authors of Forget the Alamo, which is a recent book out and a terrific book to take a look at. And Bryan, we're move slowly into deeper waters here as we go. Let's talk about the three best known heroes of the Alamo story: Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, William Travis. Now don't break our hearts, but maybe not exactly the heroes as portrayed by Fess Parker or the other actors who portrayed them over the years.
Rick. Not heroes. They're the Holy Trinity. That is the accepted phrase in Texas. I'm not making this up. For Crockett, Bowie, and Travis. Look, Davy Crockett was not exactly the Davy Crockett of the Disney movies, as I think most of us know. He was a doughy, paunchy, 49-year-old former Tennessee congressman, very famous in his day for kind of his corn-pone hillbilly act, which was very popular until it wasn't, who came to Texas with a bunch of pals trying to get, some land, certainly. Clearly Crockett, like his peer Sam Houston, who came to Texas earlier, was looking for some type of political office, perhaps in an independent Texas. Jim Bowie is the one whose real story most surprised me. Of course, Bowie is kind of the Steve McQueen of the Alamo, the brooding, dark, fighting man who is felled by drink and sickness. And in fact, we know Bowie, who was also famous in his day, due largely to a duel he fought in 1827, which popularized the Bowie knife, by the way. He turns out to be, he comes out to be pretty much a criminal. Bowie is best known, at least in legal history, as the purveyor of two massive land frauds in Louisiana and an attempted one in Arkansas, in which he dummied up, literally hundreds of Spanish land grants that he could then take. And he came to Texas after an earlier career as an illegal slave trader, a trader in illegal slaves from Cuba. He came to Texas, like a lot of people did, frankly, back then, with the law one step behind him. The fact is, if Jim Bowie had not immigrated to Texas, if he'd stayed back in his native Louisiana, there's a good chance he would have ended up swinging at the end of a rope. Travis came, as is widely known, to escape bad debts in his native Alabama. But I think what most people find objectionable about Travis is just he was a histrionic, incredibly self-righteous Southern racist. But
don't sugarcoat it for us, Bryan. We can take it.
He was a guy who kept a journal in which he kept detailed notes on every woman he ever slept with, which did end up leaving him with some type of STD, some type of venereal disease, for which he took a blue pill, which almost certainly was mercury, which almost certainly could explain some of his more erratic behavior, the sudden pulling of a knife on another lawyer in open court, this type of thing. But Travis, despite his obvious differences, was a brilliant writer. The reason that we talk about the Alamo today is not because 180 odd men died there. It's because William Barrett Travis wrote these incredible letters asking for help from the state from the aborting state government, and they were beautifully written. They were, he was a master of spin. If Travis were alive today, he would not be commander of the Alamo. He would be a PR man on Madison Avenue, because he sure knew how to write. And it was the enshrinement of those letters posthumously that really, as much as anything, made the Alamo into the legend that it's become.
And so about the legend, though, Brian, so these 186 men, they pretty much get sent by Houston, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of on a fool's errand. They get kind of left to hang. There's a desultory bombardment of the Alamo. The Santa Anna says enough is enough. He storms it. It's over pretty quick. They're dead.
Yep.
Not very glorious, pretty gory, over pretty quick. So how does the legend of what happened there start? I mean, who's saying, okay, let's turn this into something?
The legend starts with two things. One is Travis's letters. The second is when Sam Houston realized that his little army of 900 men didn't have much chance against Santa Anna's incoming Mexican army. And, he needed men with high morale. He needed men who felt they were fighting for something larger than themselves and larger than their own lives. And he came up with, of course, Remember the Alamo. And the first time that history reports that the words were spoken was during the initial charge of the Texans at San Jacinto, when a colonel on the left yelled, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," which was another slaughter of Texans, more Texans, twice as many outside the town of Goliad. And because Remember the Alamo was being shouted during the victory at San Jacinto, it became the slogan after the fact of the Texas Revolution. And then as a mass of Anglo-Americans moves into Texas afterwards and begins regarding this whole new land, where did it come from, they start writing histories. As when Texas is brought into the Union 10 years later, there's another surge of books trying to appraise, what is this place? Where did it come from? What's it about? And all of them enshrined this myth that was then so fresh. It was 5, 10, 15 years old, of these incredible men who gave their all at the Alamo to buy the time for this incredible battle at San Jacinto. And the legend just was not challenged in any serious way until the 1900s. That's the first serious thing. Remember the famous story about the line being drawn in the sand? Mm-hmm. That's probably the most famous myth of the Alamo. And we now know, as academics have before us, that this was made up by a gentleman, an amateur historian in circa the 1885, 1882 range, and was accepted as a reality there for 30, 40 years, and made its way into the dominant Texas history textbooks until it was finally kind of challenged in the early 1900s. So even 100 years ago, there was a question agitating in Texas about what really happened and what kind of can we say happened. And that percolated for what? Going on a century, until now you've had some academic history, and now a significant popular history, I would call our book, that tries to put this all into one place where ordinary people can begin to recapture the Alamo of history and not the Alamo of legend.
So one of our viewers, Gail Wright, mentions that it became even more of a legend with the Disney portrayal and the John Wayne portrayal, both of which you write about in the book, and Walt Disney's involvement in kind of creating the Davy Crockett hero image is pretty huge. I mean, for a person of my age, without giving away what that age is, the iconic Alamo image is Fess Parker on the ramparts swinging old Betsy at legions of Mexican soldiers who apparently don't want to shoot at him from a distance but want to come up and get clubbed by old Betsy before he's overwhelmed. And when I researched and wrote a little bit about Davy Crockett 15 years ago, and again saw it again in your book, I was surprised to discover that according to accounts from Mexican soldiers, because yes, there are accounts from Mexican soldiers, that Davy's
the only accounts.
What?
They're the only accounts.
They're the only accounts, yes. But it's like some people are like, well, nobody knows what happened because everybody died. And it's no.
That just drives me crazy.
Not everybody.
No, actually,
there were
the
Mexicans
side that lived, and
they didn't just kill themselves on the spot. So
they not only told the story in memoirs, they told stories in actual memos written the next morning. This type of thing. I mean, there were after-action reports of the Alamo in archives at Mexico City. Then there's no real reason to doubt most of all of them because they agree. But you're right.
But Davy's final moments are somewhat at odds with the myth, right?
But
so tell us about
the
that.
caller or the person who weighed in makes an excellent point, and they're covered, I think, in chapters 15 and 16, which my co-author Chris Tomlinson spearheaded for us. And until the World War II, 1950s era, it's fair to say that the Alamo legend was primarily a Texas thing. It would be cited by Texas politicians, every year on the anniversary, that type of thing. But it was the Disney David Crockett, which was three television movies, at the end of which, of course, climaxes with the Alamo, and more than anything, the John Wayne movie in 1960, that really brought the Alamo myth, the Alamo legend, to the broader world. It made it first a national thing, and then Wayne really, the movie, as bad as it was in some ways, and it's pretty bad in terms of its perpetuation of the myth and the Anglocentrism, really made it into a global myth. There are people, Chris, where you are in London, that know this story now that probably wouldn't have known it, before John Wayne.
Absolutely.
So the height of the Alamo myth, which follows closely after that in 1960, of course, our first Texas president, LBJ, who is the biggest Alamo head there's ever been, and Alamo head being what we call Alamo enthusiasts. LBJ would recite Alamo poetry at state dinners. He loved Alamo analogies, talking about Vietnam. Never mind that everybody died at the Alamo. Then sometimes it wasn't. But these events from 1955 to say 1970 really took a quaint regional myth and made it into a big, internationally known legend. And for that, really, it's you have to thank or blame Walt Disney, John Wayne, and LBJ.
But I need to know what do we know about what happened to Davy Crockett? And was he up there on the ramparts fighting with old Bess?
There are no accounts that I know of history of anyone saying that that's the way he fought, that that's the way he passed. We know that version. It's very strange. That version, that legend seems to come from Walt Disney, because if you go back to the 1830s, all the accounts are that Crockett surrendered and was executed, as in fact all the Mexican accounts, I believe there's 7, all agree that he was among the 7 or 8 who surrendered. Maybe he begged for his life, we don't really know, but he was executed. This idea of swinging old Betsy till he died, that's from Walt Disney, that's from John Wayne. And it really wasn't until the 70s when people started looking at Mexican accounts going, wait, that's a great story, but there's absolutely no evidence to support the idea that he went.
Well, there's only 7 accounts, you said. I mean, is 7, I don't know, is that enough? Maybe it should be 11 or 14 before we really believe it.
I don't think a lot of people are writing the history and just saying without attribution that he died. because it's always that he surrendered, because it's always been so fraught. But unfortunately, there is no evidence that I'm recalling offhand on a Sunday afternoon with a glass of wine that he went down fighting. In fact, all the evidence is to the contrary.
Right. No. I'm sure it is.
So, Brian, one of the things I'm curious is over the course of my career, I've college, grad school, et cetera, I've had to take a lot of historiography courses, and I get that a historical event, that there are interpretations 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years after an event that kind of be a little colored, a little romantic, but over time, people look at it again, they revise the story, the narrative, it evolves, but this story just is stuck in this, it just never moved, and that's one of the things I found so fascinating. So maybe kind of sketch out broadly how that happened, the historiography.
So did I. Why was it? I mean, in the 80s, in the 90s, you saw the first Texas historians actually saying exactly that point, Chris. Why hasn't this changed when we all know that it's really not true? In fact, the main reason is Texas politicians. Going back to 1898, when the first one rose on the floor of the Texas legislature and decried some newcomer in the Texas History Department who was teaching something that wasn't sufficiently pro-Southern, the Texas government has been very proactive in protecting the Texas myth. The dominant faculty that teaches Texas history for a century has, and perhaps could still be seen as, is the University of Texas. And the University of Texas was run by, the University of Texas History Department was run by a group of older white men who, from around 1905 until around 1955, taught pretty much the exact same story because they knew that's the way Texas politicians and the legislature wanted it taught. And so you see the exact same story, legend being taught in 1955 that was being taught in 1855.
Right.
Texas government wanted that way. And so you may say, well, why didn't that change? It started to change in the academic literature, probably in the 80s and 90s. But as late and as that, some of that began to filter into the conversation over textbooks, that's where it started to get really hot in the early part of this century. You can look back on this great debate about the Alamo that's happened at the education department. And we actually have a rule handed down in either 2010 or 2011 that actually says it is the law of Texas that Texas history teachers must teach that all defenders of the Alamo were, quote, heroic, that they were all heroes. It must be taught. And when those rules were up for review 2 or 3 years ago, and pretty much every professor and high school teacher on that panel that looking at drafting standards said, that's not the state is about to be majority Latino. Maybe it's time we put that myth to bed. And the governor of Texas at the time, Greg Abbott, who is still our governor today, basically spearheaded a massive attack on these people online. And so it's still the law of the land that the defenders of the Alamo must be portrayed and taught as heroic, which is, it's I don't even know what to say.
That about sums it up. I mean, I understand the popular history, obviously, and I understand writing to please an audience, but one of the things that you point out that's so interesting in this whole drama is that you have highly skilled professional historians, people that know that you're supposed to go look at the sources from the other side and you're supposed to filter all through all the information, and they're giving it a pass, which I just found really startling.
We're actually seeing this right now. When the book came out this summer, obviously, it was pretty controversial down here. The lieutenant governor, as you may know, canceled an appearance of ours at the State History Museum. And, we've talked with a lot of academics, and, almost all of them, many of them work at state universities, and they just say, look, this is nothing we can pipe up about. We can't say, we can write it in the academic literature, and they have. This book, I don't want to say there's nothing new in Forget the Alamo, but we are summarizing decades of accepted academic scholarship here. And to have some politicians attack us as fact-free, when in fact exactly the opposite is the case. We are presenting what is the agreed upon academic view of Texas history and the Alamo now. And so it's a little sad to see people who are not schooled in the details try to shut people up who actually just want to present history as it actually happened.
Well, I will say as a reader, and not exactly a reviewer, that the book struck me as thoughtful and well-researched and not particularly strident or political or fact-free in any way. And I mean, I don't want to damn you with faint praise, but I would almost say mild. I mean, there wasn't, as you said, there's some new stuff in there, but there wasn't anything that was shocking. It was.
Look, Rick, you put your finger on it. We knew from the word go that the only way anybody would listen to us is if we didn't preach. More than most books, this book had to be friendly, if you will. It had to be casual. It had to be confident. But you're not going to change many minds getting up on your soapbox and lecturing everybody how they're all wrong. Look, you can believe anything you want about Texas history. We're just trying to reclaim the actual history rather than the legend. And it's hard, but we tried to be as friendly as we could. I hope we've pulled that off.
I think you did. I want to bring in a comment or a question from a viewer, from Lynn Hargrove, who says, you're not saying that the Alamo wasn't important, are you? And that question can cut a lot of different ways, so I'll let you have a shot at it.
Well, there's two ways. Was it important to the revolution, to the military strategy of the revolution, and was important as a symbol of Texas identity? I would argue clearly the latter is important. Whatever you think about what happened that day in March 1836, the Alamo is hugely important to Texas culture, to Texas identity, to the way Texans think of themselves. Was it important to the military campaign? Academics debate that to this day. I think we come to the belief that while it's not unimportant, it was the first significant fight between Mexican and Texan forces during the Revolution. It's difficult to say that, a 3-week siege, which killed 180 guys, was particularly militarily important. A lot of people believe, Sam Houston certainly believed, that there was no tactical significance to the Alamo, to the old mission, or even to San Antonio. He wanted to withdraw and defend the rivers, the north-south rivers. So I'd say it's up in the air still. It's still a reason for debate whether or not it was tactically significant. We feel that's been overblown, but certainly the idea of the Alamo, the image of it, the symbolism has been hugely important to the state's cultural development. I don't think there's any denying that.
So I want to talk a little bit about the site itself. Given its importance and given its place in Texas history and Texas identity, I don't think I'm being out of line by a little story from when I was growing up. I was a kid. I watched the John Wayne movie. I loved it. My nan bought me the Alamo playset from Sears and Roebuck, and we make the big family trip across country, and we're going to go visit the Alamo, and I was so excited. I just couldn't wait. And we finally get there, and I'm like,
what a letdown.
What is that? So
everybody knows. It's unanimous. Even the Alamo's biggest backers in San Antonio, sitting on the board that runs the thing, will tell you, yeah, it's a bit of a letdown. It's a little dingy chapel without a lot of signage or things that explain to you what really happened. There's a little museum that's not great, with a little film that looks like it was put together by a 9th grade history class. Look, the fact is, people of San Antonio and the state of Texas have been trying to figure out how to gussy out the Alamo for going on 50 years. And they've been arguing about it for 50 years. Rolling around come the 90s, the city fathers managed to get a lot of people on the same page, because let's be clear, Native Americans have been complaining about graves because the Alamo Plaza outside is the site of an old Native American a graveyard. Mexican Americans, Tejanos, have been arguing about its importance and how they belong in the history just as long as Anglos have. Even African Americans have come up and said, well, hey, this Walgreens across the street is important to civil rights because it's one of the first place blacks were able to dine alongside Anglos. So everybody it took forever to get everybody on the same page. They finally did just in the 2010s. There is now a plan to make a world-class museum built around, and Chris, I'll nod to you because you'll know who Phil Collins is, as the great drummer of Genesis and now quite a singer in his own right, who has, and I'm surprised how many people didn't know this. This was one of the few things about the Alamo I did know. Phil Collins is the world's greatest Alamo enthusiast. He owns the largest collection of Alamo memorabilia in the world. And
I have to jump in. I have to jump in here and say this was the shocker in your book, right? This was the thing.
So many people.
Crockett, Bowie, Travis, I'm there, Stephen Austin, Sam Houston, Santa Ana, and then suddenly it's Phil Collins, and he is, so he's a huge collector. But that is also a story that's not free of controversy and issues as well.
Let's just say, first off, everybody loves Phil Collins. There's nobody that likes or doesn't like his collection, just think he's a great guy. There's nobody that has a bad word to say Phil Collins. Now, the collection, that's another thing. This collection is now supposed to be the centerpiece of a $400 million, now maybe downsized to $250 million museum that is going to be a wholesale reimagining of the Alamo. It's going to be like a whole block-wide park-type deal. The problem was, and we didn't go into this thinking we were going to be writing about Phil Collins and his collection, but we did get a tip midway through from a fairly high-placed source, if you will, at the Alamo that Phil's collection was not quite what it was cooked up to be. There's a lot in it that's authentic, especially the documents. But there is real concern among collectors and gallerists and experts that an awful lot of the most important items, especially those connected to the Holy Trinity, if you will, as well as James Bonham and people like that, have very little in the way of authentication papers, and many of them appear to be fakes, modern-made fakes. And that's a real concern when you're trying to build, a $400 million museum. So that was one of the things that got people's attention when we came out and published that, I guess, back in May, in an excerpt on the cover of Texas Monthly.
Now, one of the things, I want to get your take on it. Your book was informative. It was entertaining. I enjoyed it. I laughed. I was interested. Everything. But the one part of the book that really struck me the most, really affected me, made me very sad, was when you were talking about Mexican Americans and saying that it's not as big a deal for them as it is for Anglo Americans, but every Mexican American kid knows after the 7th grade he's different than everybody else.
Yeah.
And that just really...
It's hard to write about. It's hard to talk about, especially as an Anglo guy who's, bringing you the stories of people of another ethnicity. I almost want to apologize about that up front, but it was the most shocking thing to me in the book. And to people who don't understand what we're talking about, what we're saying is that the Alamo legend has been used to kind of beat down Latinos in the state for a long time ago. Envision the beefy Anglo bully, hitting a little Latino guy in the shoulder and saying, "Hey, remember the Alamo there, Jose?" And it's always been a way to keep Mexican Americans, Latinos, Tejanos in their places. And when you talk to as many as we did, both academics, politicians, Latino normal people, you hear the story over and over. I thought I was American. I believed in the Statue of Liberty. I thought the Declaration of Independence was about me. until they taught the Alamo in 7th grade. And then I realized we're just Mexicans and we're always going to be Mexicans. And I'm not some woke lefty who throws around words like oppressive or oppression very often. The pretty strong case that culturally the Alamo legend has been used to oppress Mexican Americans in the state for a long, long time. And those who have come out and said and try to express their truth have been basically hooted down. We cite, examples of that in the book. So, when I hear people pushing the Anglo-eccentric legend these days, I somehow say, wow, I bet, aren't you like me? Do you know what that story, that legend means to your Latino neighbors? I didn't. I had no clue. And we suggest in the book softly that if more Anglos knew what that story really means to Latinos, would they be fighting so hard to preserve it? I wonder.
Well, that's yeah. I mean, I think it was a very moving part of the book, and it's a great question. But and look, Texas is changing, right? And you pointed that earlier. You're going to have probably I don't know the demographics probably as well as you do, but you're going to have a Hispanic majority probably at some point in the near future.
Yeah, those are down to 41%. And yet, Rick, if you look at again, I don't want to come off as someone who's just attacking everybody, but when you look at the state government and especially the state media, there's not a lot of brown. It remains very Anglo, and so there's a lot of people who don't really value this lesson. They don't see that it's particularly important. There are those who are well-meaning that think that it's not our story. We don't want to get in trouble for telling someone else's story. We came to that moment in our book and realized, no, it's not. We don't know. It's not our story to tell. But we wouldn't be doing our jobs as writing a historiography if we didn't say what this meant, why this is important, why it matters, because of what it's done to a group of people in the state who are poised to become a majority in a year now.
So today I think it's very popular that people use revisionism almost as a pejorative, and it's a misuse of the word. And in the case of the history of the Alamo, the historiography of the event, when did revisionist histories of the event kind of start being looked at and being considered and brought into the conversation?
Really,
and can we just for those of us who have trouble with long words, can we explain maybe what historiography is? Because
historiography is just a history of the history.
History of the history.
It's not just a history of the event. It's a history of how the story came to be told the way it is. Revisionism, at least as it's popularly used, really began around the sesquicentennial of the battle itself and the revolution in 1986. But the first major the first major book of it came out in 1990 by a guy named Jeff Long. It's called Duel of Eagles, and it is a fabulously angry retelling of the Texas Revolution, in which everybody who's Anglo is pretty much a bad guy. And it's a little over the top, but it really turned a lot of heads and got people to start reassessing. And we say that this was kind of the big bang of Texas revisionism, and that the 90s was really the golden age. When every few months there was a panel or a book or an academic article or a new argument on how Davy died or what this all meant. I mean, suddenly it's all everybody was talking about. 25 years later, we've forgotten that, because in Texas, a very conservative framework of government came in around the turn of the century, and suddenly for those who are interested in traffic in new ideas and claiming the actual history, that kind of has become harder in the last 20 years. But Chris, to your point, Jeff Long, who wrote that book in 1990, said to me in an interview, and I think he's right, that the revisionism here is what happened beginning in 1836. The actual facts of the battle and the revolution were revised into this legend that made generations of Anglo-Texans feel just great about themselves. What people are trying to do now is reclaim the actual facts of history. And that's what gets people upset, because it doesn't jibe with a legend that is so central to Texas identity. And I say that, and Rick, if you're from Rhode Island, you can sit there and say, well, there are not a lot of people I know walking around in Providence talking about their identity as Rhode Islanders. Well, there are in Texas. There are in Texas. Let me tell you, this is serious stuff down here. It was serious stuff when I was in 7th grade. It was serious stuff when I went away to college in Missouri and hung a Texas flag in my dorm room. It's serious. People in Texas really do, at least those of us who've been here a while, believe that in some way, shape, or form, because we began as the only province or state or country to defeat a foreign power in war, to be an independent nation that chose to merge with the United States.
Oh, hey, by the way, Rhode Island was too an independent nation a little long before Texas, but let's not go there. Okay.
I'm just saying, Rick, in Texas, that there are people who measure their ranches in the number of Rhode Islands.
All right. We are writing on. I'm afraid we're having some technical difficulty with Steve right now. His sound is going out with Bryan. I can't even remember his name. It's so upsetting to me. Hey, listen, but let's shift gears here a little bit, because I do have a very serious and important question for you, which is I have written books with a co-author. I've written 2 books with 2. Each one had a co-author, and but I have never written a book with 2 other co-authors. So writing a book with 3 people. How the hell do you do that? Because it seems to me, how do you just stop there not being a fight the entire time?
I can't say we didn't have our share. It helped that we liked each other. We got about 2/3 of the way in and realized some parts of the book were requiring a lot more work than we thought. And so one person moved off one chunk of the book, and suddenly we had 2 people taking, the back third of the book. Frankly, Phil Collins kind of blew up on us. And so Chris and Jason really got in together and did an awful lot of in-person interview views to take that home, while I remained back mostly in the 1800s. It came together because it had to come together. Ultimately, I will say, I will confess, it came in way too long. I think Chris measured, we cut 27% of the book a year ago, August.
How many Rhode Islands is that?
That was a couple of months worth of work. They just ended because our editor said, "There's a great book in here someplace. Would you please edit it down so I can find it?" And, we did. Chris led the way on that. I did a lot of it. And the book is 2/3 of the length it initially was. And I'll say it's a heck of a lot better than what we turned in. So all of which is to say, if you think it's difficult working with 3 co-authors, it is. Luckily we had a researcher, my one-time partner, Maggie Walsh, who is great at convening powwows and peace sessions. And in addition to being a fabulous researcher, and we made it. In the end, we made it. We came out, and to my great surprise, the book, became, a top 10 bestseller, and it is being read because I had no confidence that anybody was really going to care.
They care, Bryan.
Turns out they did.
They care.
So, one of the things is as you read your book, you're following the battles and the struggles of people to interpret the event, and it's the weight of history is so heavy during all this, and you trace it wonderfully. Not only the events, how the site is saved, how it's interpreted, what they're doing with it now, the fight for the museum and what that's going to look like. Given just how complex and nuanced this has become, both the myth and the reality, can you ever get this story right? Can we ever come up with the narrative that we can all say, okay?
I tend to think time and different demographics will take care of a lot of this. a lot of the people who feel most fervently and believe most fervently in the traditionalist Anglo-centric narrative, the legend, if you will, caught the bug from Davy Crockett. They caught it from Fess Parker and John Wayne. And those people will be slowly passing from the scene. I dare say younger Texans in their teens and 20s today, many of them don't even get it, what we're talking about, why this matters so much. And so I tend to think that as Texas becomes younger, and certainly as it becomes less white and more people of color, that an agreed upon narrative, not necessarily obviating the Anglo contributions, which were immense, but which find room for everyone's contributions, brown, black, white, everything, I think will become more accepted. You can say that's naive. It wouldn't be the last time I've been called naive on this project, but I'd like to believe that time heals all wounds.
Well, we started the interview with you calling yourself naive, so I guess we can end it with that. And certainly, if you think the Texas hate mail is bad, wait till you get the Rhode Island hate mail. So it's coming. It's coming. So listen, I want to thank Bryan Burrough for joining us. He is one of three co-authors of, or maybe co isn't the right word, but three authors of Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth. And both Chris and I enjoyed that book. It was terrific. And I think it got Nancy Nallens pointed out, it got a good review in the New York Times. So I do suggest you check it out. And Bryan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and sharing about the book.
It was wonderful. Thanks, Bryan. Good luck.
Thank you.
All the best. Stay well. Chris, that was terrific. That was fun. I'm shaking. I'm shaking because of the Rhode Island thing. But I'm just gonna. And
Somebody's got to stick up for Rhode Island.
My sister and I are gonna have to talk. It's a little scary. And I want to thank everybody for the comments and questions. And I know it's a book that touches a lot of. It touches a nerve with some folks, but it's very interesting, and I do suggest you read it before you judge it, because it is a pretty interesting book. And next week, Chris, we welcome back anchorman, author, and most importantly, History Happy Hour veteran guest.
That's what's the most important to him.
That is pinnacle. Okay. Chris Wallace, to talk about his new book, Countdown Bin Laden: The Untold Story of the 247-Day Hunt to Bring the Mastermind of 9/11 to Justice, which I think is about as close to current events as we are ever going to get on this show.
I would say so.
And maybe closer than we want to get, but hopefully
it'll be wonderful. I'm
sure it'll be very, very interesting. And Chris was a great guest when he came on to talk about his atomic bomb book, and I'm sure he'll be quite interesting next week as well. So looking forward to that. And thanks for joining us. And special thanks to our Patreon supporters. And hey, everybody, make sure to like or subscribe or follow or do those things. Do all that stuff. It helps us. And helps you find out what's going on in the show. So we appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Oh, I got to hit the thing.